Hello, hello. Welcome back. This is Philosophy Roulette, somehow. Philosophy Roulette 244, where I read and review philosophy papers live on air. It's been a hot minute since I read any papers, but, well, I'm grumpy, tired, and angry. But what does that have to do with philosophy? So, let's just go see what's new. Who the hell knows? Who the hell cares? Derivability meta-inferential validity, Journal of Philosophical Logic. You know, these are probably a good paper, but I can't read philosophical logic on stream. It just doesn't work as a stream thing. Let's see what PPR has. Southern Journal, good stuff. Agency and the successive structure of time consciousness. I argue for constraining the nomological possibility, that is the law-like possibility of possibility space of temporal existences, and endorsing the succession requirement for agents. So I guess that means there is some law governing the succession of agents in some sort of basic structure of temporal existence must be successive for agent subjects. So I guess it means in the world the ways the laws are the same way of ours. So I guess it would mean we have to have a succession in our the way we see the world. That has to be a series of some sort. Well, if you don't put your paper up, I'm not going to read it. Let's see what's forthcoming from PPR, if they have their page numbers or not. If they don't, I'm not. Let's go back. Let's see what we have here. Anything short? Replies. Plato's moral psychology distinguishes two theses that might be taken as foundational to Plato's psychologizing. Huh. 3 pages. How do you write anything in 3 pages? Seems like reviews or something. Let's see. Is it? Well, it doesn't matter if it's not here. Alright. Let's see. Comments on this. Oh, maybe they're all comments on this moral psychology stuff. Huh. Monotonicity in the new minors puzzle. This is 14 pages. I am too tired to read something. I'm just going to go to analysis. You know what? I think I'm just going to go to analysis. Deal with analysis stuff. Interesting. Let's see if there's anything that looks super awesome. Reply to Costa and Colosi. Taking metaphysics seriously, Kant on foundations of ethics, inquiry, and interdisciplinary general philosophy, desires, their objects, and things leading to pursuit, more general philosophical logic, philosophia, knowledge from falsehood, ignorance of necessary truths and safety, Phil studies, Bayesian sensitivity, principles for evidence-based knowledge, synthesis, the cost of closure, logical realism, anti-exceptionalism, and theoretical equivalence. Michaela McSweeney. Let's see. I have something to say on the closure. It's very difficult, closure. Nah. Well, I'll click on it. Let's see. A puzzle about epistemic value. I just don't know how long this stuff is. Analysis. Living your best life. That seems very good. Michaela McSweeney. How long is this? This might be something for future Noger to read. 1 of 29 double-spaced. That is very workable. Let's see what this has to say. It is commonly assumed by philosophers of science that logically equivalent theories are in fact theoretically equivalent. I argue that 2 theses, anti-exceptionalism about logic, which says roughly that logic is not a priori, that it is revisable, and that it is not special or set apart from other human inquiry, and logical realism, which says roughly that the differences in logic reflect genuine metaphysical differences in the world, make trouble for both this commitment and for the closely related commitment to theories being closed under logical consequence. I provide three arguments. The first two show that anti-exceptionalism about logic provides an epistemic challenge to both the closure and equivalence claims. And the third shows that logical realism provides a metaphysical challenge to both the closure and the equivalence claims. Along the way, I show that there are important methodological upshots for metaphysicians and philosophers of science and philosophers of logic. In particular, there are lessons to be drawn about certain conceptions of naturalism constraining the possibilities for metaphysics and the philosophy of logic. Well, this could be a fun paper. But if the analysis stuff is here, I'm going to go read that one because it's going to be shorter. And that's what's more important at the moment. Whatever. Living your best life. That seems more prescient right now. See, that's 10 pages. The other one was 29. Now, granted, this is single-spaced, but see, if you double it, that only gets to 20, not 29. So that's how you win. You be shorter. Okie dokie. For all those people viewing live, and if you show up later, you can always type !paper in the chat, and you'll get the link to the paper. So good, it showed up. Yeah. So let's see. Cool. So yeah, Living Your Best Life by August Gorman. It is almost August, which is very scary. Leading public figures have put forth strong positions about the general conditions under which it makes sense for a person to choose to die rather than to go on living, and when it makes sense to instead to go on living. These views run the gamut from Ezekiel Emanuel's view that it is unreasonable for just about anyone to engage in extensive life-saving measures after age 75, to Atul Gawande's dictum that it is always possible to find beauty or meaning in what's left. By contrast, I share with Francis Calm the general orientation that there is nothing quite so idiomatic and generalizable to say about the matter. Okay, I apologize for how I say everyone's names. And Almost Over, Aging, Dying, Dead, Francis Calm embraces a humane middle position that seeks to make sense and to some degree, vindicate people's widely varying choices about which lives they would choose to continue living. While much of the book consists of criticism of different overly generalized positions, she also puts forth a principle to support her conclusions that she calls the prudential prerogative. An analogy to the moral prerogative that she argues for elsewhere, which supports the permissibility of engaging in personal projects in lieu of spending all of one's time volunteering, the prudential prerogative holds that in a fairly wide range of conditions we are under no intrapersonal rational obligation to choose either to die or to live on. According to Calm, there is often sufficient reason to either live on or to die, and thus no decisive reason for or against living on, even when the choice is in tension with living the best life that one could live. Okay, so what do we got? We got some sort of moral prerogative. I have no idea what this is. I mean, it might be kind of interesting to find out what the moral prerogative is. Like, don't know what that means, but like, so what? If you think in terms of like probability, there's something called the now I'm completely losing it. It just basically says that principle of indifference, that if you don't have enough information about what's happening, you should just assign everything equal probabilities, because you know what? You should be indifferent since you have no information. You should be indifferent to how the world will turn out. So just do everything, proceed as if everything, all the reasonable possibilities, are not like crazy ones, but like all the reasonable ones are equally probable. So in short, like if you're flipping a coin, now of course this coin is an actual U.S. quarter. It's not perfectly fair, but like you might as well. I don't know the difference, and as far as I know, it is as close to fair as I'm ever going to worry about. So I'm going to treat both heads and tails as being equally likely. So maybe that's kind of where we're going here. If you have no this prudential prerogative, like you don't know which one's better, which one's prudential, then maybe you won't have a sufficient reason to either live on or to die because of maybe just some sort of epistemic lack. You just don't know. Okay, so let's see where we're going with this. The prudential prerogative stands in contrast to two competing views about when it is and is not reasonable to choose to end for your life to end. Additivism. It doesn't make sense to choose for your life to end unless the sum of goods, taking into account degree, left in your life minus the sum of bads, taking into account degree, is negative. Okay, so this is like a pure utilitarian sort of goes like add everything up, but additivism. So, add. Life holism. It doesn't make sense to choose for your life to end unless the life you would have if you end it now is better than the life you would have if you had lived on, when the two lives are considered as wholes. So I guess this is comparing your whole life now versus your whole life if you added, like if you just continued living, it'd be kind of like those whole things in some sort of non-additive way, but some sort of holistic way, then one is going to be better than the other, and you should choose the one that's better. The prudential prerogative holds, by contrast, that it can make sense to end your life even if neither of these circumstances are the case. There is instead a different set of principles governing the bounds of which lives one has sufficient prudential reason to choose to end. 1. Only very serious personal costs can stand in the way of getting a greater good for oneself, so it does not make sense to choose to die in order to avoid having a relatively minor outpatient surgery. 2. It is not just that there is some threshold severity of badness that makes it unreasonable to go on, because it can be reasonable to undergo a significant period of torture in hell to gain eternal life with God. In order to decide whether it is worth living through some amount of pain, you must consider not only the degree of the bad you'll endure, but also how good the payoff is for living through it, in ratio to each other. The ratio must be great enough to make it reasonable. 3. While it would be unreasonable to refuse to currently suffer some amount of bad to forego a greater future bad, it is not similarly unreasonable to refuse to suffer a significant bad that is bundled with a great amount of good. So whereas you are rationally required to choose the moderately painful death that would happen now over excruciating painful death that would happen a few minutes from now, you are not required to endure something similarly painful in order to stay alive to get further goods. Okay, so there's some sort of threshold here. That's what they were saying. And it's not just that there's a threshold, because there's a relative notion. So it's not like there's an absolute threshold. There's a relative one, because this is the old Pascal's wager. I mean, if it's annoying and you don't believe in God, you should still believe in God, because the payoff is life in heaven with God if you believe in God. But if you have to just like suffer like pretending or like believing that in God that you don't actually think is the case, that's kind of what's going on here. Number 2 is you've got some sort of wager. You have to decide what's the degree of the bad, as is said. So this is a relative degree. And then there's some sort of difference in kind here. So like you should like die quickly now if you are inevitably going to die painfully soon. But like if you are, you think there's a potential for goods, you don't have to endure the pain now for non-realized goods, which is kind of an interesting thing too. So there's a difference in kind. It's not just a simple add and subtract in this number 3. Okay. Within these bounds that are here roughly gestured at, you are prudentially justified deciding to end your life or deciding to continue on, even when doing so is at odds with what it would take to make it true that you had lived a better life. While I agree with Com that additivism is false, I find her prudential prerogative to be unmotivated. In this article, I will do two things. I will show that in terms of life or death cases, life holism fares at least as well as the prudential prerogative in its ability to capture the normative phenomena that Com is interested in. Next, I'll argue that the features of the moral prerogative that make it an attractive principle do not transfer to the prudential prerogative. Com's argument in Almost Over should not sway us from our conviction that we ought to try to live our best lives. I mean, I don't know what a life holism is, though, of course, so that's just sort of like, I don't know how you judge whole lives. I mean, isn't that also some sort of, if you're not adding up a score, like a life score, then what are you doing? Like, what are the criteria? I don't know. All right, so we're going to get to life holism, the prudential prerogative, and individualized choices. The heart of Com's view, I take it, is this. People can have different perspectives on what is and is not worth living for, and one's perspective is not necessarily more reasonable than the next. Com uses the prudential prerogative to support, for example, the view that people can vary fairly widely in the amount of suffering that they are or are not willing to endure to accrue for future benefits while remaining reasonable from a prudential perspective. She also argues that it is not unreasonable to choose to live on in old age only if one will have access to future goods that will provide meaning in one's life, and it is not unreasonable to choose to live on without them. The reason that there are different responses to this situation that would be justified is, I take it, that it is just a matter of whether or not the person happens to care about their future having goods that will provide meaning in their life or not. So that's interesting. So you have to, even if their life has good, like future goods and stuff, you have to care now about those future goods. So it's like, it's hard to tell a teenager, look, don't do that stupid thing. Don't do that stupid thing. Because, like, in the future, you're going to regret that stupid thing. You'd be like, but that stupid thing is fun now. So it's like, yeah, you have to be a sort of person that cares about the future thing. It can't just be that, like, there is that thing in the future. Because it's unrealized. And unrealized future goods are not the same as tangible, like, goods here and now. Okay. Continuing. Notice, though, that one does not need to adopt the principle of prudential prerogative in order to accommodate this perspective. Life holism can also hold that for some people, a life that ends with a period devoid of meaningful pursuits will be worse than a life that ends before such a period occurs, but for some people, the reverse is true. Life holism can also hold that suffering has different value in different lives. Perhaps the suffering of a martyr contributes to the value of her life in a different way than the suffering of a cancer patient. Given life holism, you can have two cases in which the rough description of the choice situation is the same, but you end up with two different answers to whether or not the person ought prudentially to continue living because the case lacks relevant facts about the person as an individual. Again, I don't understand how this actually works. Life holism, the whole point of holism is that you can't compare things. They're wholes. And if you're wholes, you've got like metaphysically different things. And so how do you compare them here? And so the question, if you can say that life holism can account for these things that the other theories can, you have to kind of show how. But then you are comparing it, and you're not doing it holistically. You're looking at individual things. You're doing it compositionally, not holistically. So, a little odd. I find this strange. Take, for example, the following set of cases. Amani is an 80-year-old woman who has an injury that is painless, but will prove rapidly fatal if she does not undergo a particular operation. While the operation is proven to be 100% successful, it involves a lengthy and excruciatingly painful recovery period. Her life is otherwise going very well, and she is sure to have 10 years of reasonably blissful and meaningful existence post-recovery. Beatrice is another 80-year-old woman who faces the same circumstances as Amani. She too faces the choice of whether or not to undergo the surgery, given the choice between letting the injury take its course or undergoing a period of excruciating pain followed by 10 great years. The additivist must conclude that Amani and Beatrice either both have decisive prudential reason to undergo the surgery or both have decisive prudential reason to refuse, determined exclusively by just how good those 10 years will be, and whether that goodness outweighs the amount of badness incurred during the recovery period. The life holist, however, can be open to the possibility that Amani has decisive prudential reason to undergo the surgery, and Beatrice has decisive prudential reason to refuse, keeping all of the facts about the recovery period, hey Tindaris, what's up, and the following decade the same, given differences about what makes for a better overall life for them as individuals. What am I reading? This is a paper called Living Your Best Life. There's basically, it looks like, some theories about when you're allowed to, like, basically end your own life. What is the point of continuing to live at certain points in your life if, like, you've got problems? And so there's two theories. They call them additivism and life holism. Additivism basically says you add up all the goods in your life and you add up all the bads in your life, and if the bads outweigh the goods going forward, then it's reasonable to end your own life. The other one says, look, holism, you have to look at the lives as a whole. And so it's not you just add up goods and bads, but you're saying, well, what is a whole life? And is this whole life here, like, ended now, better than, like, that whole life that ends differently? And so you're not adding up good and bad, but you're sort of looking at, like, the biography. This is a 10-page paper. I'm only on page 3. This author is arguing that there is, like, this middle view, and the author is arguing that this middle view actually doesn't work, that the holism is just better than the middle view. I don't know if they are arguing against additivism, but they're arguing that the holism is better than this alternative. So, yeah. So, yeah. So, basically, we've got, I don't know, you can go to that website and there's a download link. Yeah. Usually, for all those other people watching, type paper, and if you're watching later, because I post this to YouTube, the link will be below. Yeah, so we've got two 80-year-old women, both of whom are looking at some painful, crappy surgery with recovery, but once they get better, they're going to have about another good decade ahead of them. And so the activists must conclude that Imani and Beatrice both have the same reasons, and so both must choose for the surgery. The holist doesn't have to do that. I'm not sure why. It just seems kind of ad hoc. But, yeah. See, given the differences about what makes for the better overall life for them as individuals, that just seems like better overall life ad hoc, like whatever they make up. I don't understand what this as individuals criteria is actually doing. So, like this right here. I don't know if you can see that online, but yeah. Okay, so continuing. And feel free to ask questions. I'll try to explain it. This is my first time reading it, though. Perhaps Amani's life has been full of trials and tribulations. She is ready to take on her next challenge, and facing this operation bravely fits with her conception of herself and of the life she is meant to live. She doesn't derive any additional source of pleasure from this, but rather simply sees this as a fitting next stage of her life. Beatrice, on the other hand, we can imagine, has always intentionally arranged her life first and foremost so as to avoid discomfort. Her parents were migrant laborers who physically toiled to provide a comfortable life for her, and she has come to embody this destiny. One of the ways that Beatrice honors her parents and her sense of self is by maintaining a peaceful and pleasant life of simple pleasures with no great obstacles to overcome. To now undertake this surgery would, for her, be a betrayal of her deeply felt priorities and the project of living that has provided the scaffolding of her life story. The life holist can hold, in one sense, that people can vary widely in the amount of suffering they are or are not willing to endure to accrue future benefits while remaining reasonable from a prudential perspective. But the life holist will claim there's some sort of explanation available as to which option for that person will make the most sense from the perspective of what makes the best life that individual person can have. So while people differ widely from each other as to what amount of suffering is worth it for themselves, there is still a correct answer for each individual, taking into account the kind of life that is best for them. Okay, so here's what we got. We've got this, and I don't want to come off as like I hate this author. I don't. I think this is well done. But like this is basically an appeal to emotions here. Like this is an appeal to like, oh, both of these people have like the sort of like good, reasoned understandings of their lives, and they're just like, they have very different conceptions of what they're doing, and therefore they are coming to different conclusions. The problem with this is it's still a compositional thing. People are still breaking it down in certain ways. And so like this holism doesn't actually be holistic in any way. You're still looking at it as a add and subtract version, just based on different measurements of adding and subtracting. Beatrice is adding and subtracting based on a different sort of on looking at her deeply felt priorities in the project of living in a comfortable way, whereas Amani is looking at it in terms of what is this compared, in some sense, to the prior struggles that she had already faced. And so they're using incompatible measurement schemes. And that's okay, but you're still using a sort of an additive scheme here. And that's what this is doing right here. It's trying to like tell you that there's some sort of holism going on, but what's really happening is they're just using different additive schemes, to my ear at least. And I think people get angry with my interpretation of this because they want to say, hey, look, this is about honor and family. But really, what are those coming down to? Because they're still judging the future life compared to the past life, which is what the additive person does. And you're saying, well, no, this is a whole life. Well, what is a whole life except for if you add this? Add it all up. So I'm not like, I find this distinction troubling. And like I said earlier, this distinction is not this author's fault. This is an existing distinction within the literature. And so this is not like the author messed up. The author did not mess up. The author's fine. This is just one of my general problems with these kinds of theories that are claiming to be holistic, but when you get down to how is a holism actually understood, it's not holistic anymore. Because then it would be incomparable. It'd be like apples and oranges. I mean, you can compare apples and oranges, but then you have to find something in common between the two. Alright, continuing. Calm's prudential principle goes further in claiming that it doesn't need to matter to Beatrice or Amani's deliberation which overall life would be better, given that the ratio between the blissfulness of the 10 years and the painfulness of recovery is in the right range. Neither Amani nor Beatrice has decisive prudential reason to choose either way, even if their choices are in direct conflict with with living the lives that would be best for them as individuals. And this is the argument that says basically we just don't know how things are going to turn out exactly. And so as long as it's not like completely skewed in one way or the other, you don't actually have a good it's not so easy to see which is the right decision. Okay. While it's a benefit of a view that it can accommodate the fact that Beatrice and Amani can both be fully justified in their decisions of whether or not to undergo the surgery while coming to opposite conclusions, I do not see how it is a further benefit to say that either of them could choose against the option that would lead to the best life for them while remaining justified in their choice. Notice that Amani can ask the question, in the long run, is the best thing for me to do to get the surgery? And have the answer be yes. So you would think that what Amani ought to do is to get the surgery, but Calm says that so long as the painful recovery period is at least painful to some reasonable degree and relative to the goodness of the following 10 years, Amani would nevertheless have sufficient reason not to get the surgery. This is a strange implication. What kind of reason is it to make your choice if it's not coming from what your prudentially best option is? Well, now I actually do have a beef with the author here, because it looks like they're forcing the setup to go back to being additive, because this is the ratio here. Where did they say that? To some degree, yeah. Here we go. So right here, reasonable to degree relative to the goodness. So we're doing it again. We're doing some sort of additive thing here. So I don't know. This seems like a little bit of a question begging to me, because we're doing a relative goodness to a reasonable degree, which seems like an additive thing. Now, if you're going to go with the holism, you have to be hard line on the holism and be like, no. You can't do that because the relative goodness is irrelevant to the holism. It's that this is how I add up my life. No, this is how I see my life. I don't add up relative goodness. And so it doesn't matter that there are good times ahead. Even if, like, I think I'm adding it up to good times ahead, that's not what I do. Like, that's just my principles. I don't do that stuff. So it's like one of those Ring of Gyges from ancient philosophy. You're like, hey, look, I can steal that watch over there, and no one's gonna ever know. I'm gonna steal that watch, and I'm gonna get away with it. And if you know you're gonna get away with it, say you're like leaving the country, so you can steal a nice watch. You're leaving the country, never get to come back. So it's completely you're just gonna gain the benefit of having a nice watch. Okay. But that's not the sort of thing you do. And so it's like, well, what is it? What is a sort of question that you ask yourself? Are you a watch thief or are you not a watch thief? And so it's like, what is your prudentially best option? Well, what do you mean by prudentially at that point? And I don't think the author here has stuck to their guns. Okay. So that's a small point of contention I have with what's going on. Like right here. Com says in a footnote that Kiran Satya has suggested that the prudential principle is in tension with the buck-passing view of goodness, according to which saying that something would maximize the good in one's life means that there is the most reason to choose it. Com suggests that this tension may not exist, but if it does, she thinks so much the worse for the buck-passing view, but the prudential principle seems to be in conflict not just with a certain account of reasons, but also with the commonsensical intuition that buck-passing account aims to explain by giving an analysis of goodness in terms of reasons. Yikes, that's a long sentence. I think the period was missed. Namely, that we ought to do things that are good for us, and if something else would be even better, then we ought to do that instead. Again, yes, popcorn is the way to go. I agree, Tinderos. This is goodness in terms of reasons. Again, how do you judge goodness of reasons? I don't know. Alright, continuing. In severing the tight connection between goodness and reasons, Com's view is not only in tension with the buck-passing view, but also the main rival view that goodness is fundamental and reasons are explicable in terms of goodness. Life holism need not be construed as having the same tension. The fittingness of undergoing the surgery for Mani's life story and the fittingness of refusing the surgery for Beatrice's life story may be construed as goods for these respective agents that make their different life paths most choice-worthy. Yes. Fittingness. Now we're getting into longer words here. Scary things, longer words. Thus, the life holist can claim that maximizing the goodness of one's life will always be consistent with what one has the most reason to do when considering one's own interests. But nevertheless, one's own good can be maximized by goods that are only available to a person as individual with all of her particularities. If it is possible to capture the important results Com aims to explain by reference to if it is possible to capture the important results Com aims to explain by reference to the prudential principle without having to take recourse to a principle that betrays the seeming truism that goodness and reasons have a tight connection, then we should try to do that. Again, we're getting into the metaphors here, and I'm not even like angry with the author. Like, this is again standard stuff, but tight connection. Fittingness. Wow, it's pouring outside. So we've got a tight connection, fittingness. So we've got a different conception here now of what is going on. Now, how close do your choices fit with a story? Again, they're giving you a conceptual analysis or an analogy to try to get you to understand that, look, this is not an add up, but again, how do you judge a fittingness or how tight a connection is to make something seem consistent? Consistency, when you get outside of like strict logic, is not so clear. And feel free to ask questions, of course. I mean, I think I'm going a little hard on the author because, like I said, this is standard reasoning that people give, but I dislike it. Okay, continuing. Suppose now that the injury Amani and Beatrice are suffering from is a kind of injury that painlessly makes a person slip into a coma until the surgery can be performed. Instead of being faced with the choice of whether or not to undergo the surgery themselves, their loved ones are instead faced with making the choice on their behalf. Their loved ones, let's suppose, want to act in accordance with Amani and Beatrice's reasons, not on their own self-interested reasons. Wow, that's a great family. According to Calm's picture, it seems though both women's loved ones have sufficient reason to choose either subject them to either subject them to the surgery or not. What's strange here is that Calm wouldn't want to deny that there is a fact of the matter about whether or not the surgery would be best for Amani and Beatrice with regards to what is good for them in the sense that it leads to the best possible life for them. But their loved ones, it would seem, need not take this into consideration, since the facts that justify either choice are just the ratio of degree of harm that would be caused by the recovery period in proportion to the goodness of the years to follow. Again with this, like this ratio stuff, if you're going to do a holism, how are you doing ratios? These reasons, unlike the reasons that make one life course better or worse for Amani or Beatrice in particular, seem strangely impersonal and non-specific to the individuals in question. In this way, life holism actually seems able to do better in terms of taking into account the perspectival interests of Amani and Beatrice. It predicts that Amani's loved ones ought to elect the surgery and Beatrice's loved ones ought to refuse it on her behalf. Again, but if you're taking into account ratios, it's which ratios are you choosing? If you're always sticking with the goods and the bads, these people do not add up the goods and the bads on their own. So it's like, well, I mean, goods and the bads in the same way. So maybe this is, I'm begging the question for holism, but it seems so odd that everyone would have the exact same goods and bads. Calm also goes on the offensive against life holism, writing that there is no duty fulfilled or even virtue in maximizing the overall goodness of one's life, let alone by sacrificing what would give one a good enough future. On the face of it, this does seem concerning. Why should acting according to your prudential reasons ever require, rather than merely allow, sacrificing your good future? I want to suggest that the sting of this criticism can be alleviated by adopting a form of life holism that has a subjectivist component. To illustrate, let's examine what Calm says about the following case. What if additional life would be deeply inconsistent with previous life or with past current reasonable values, but it would be just as good or even a better life according to different reasonable values? An example might be being an aesthete and then being a monk. This could yield an entire life with no connectedness between its past and its future. I do not think that continuing in such a life is necessarily worse than nothing for a person, even though, judged as a whole, it may seem odd. I don't think it is necessarily senseless to choose such a life or to choose death in the absence of sufficient connectedness. There could be sufficient, just not decisive, reason to do either. Alright, so this is the question. I mean, look. If you really don't know what's going to come down the pipe for you, like you really don't know, you don't have to kill yourself. You can just disappear. Sorry about that. You can just disappear. You can go. Like there's, what's it called? And I don't know if this is true, but like apparently there were people in downtown Manhattan on September 11th that just walked away from their lives because no one could follow them like that day. You could walk away. You could become someone completely different and just like make a hard break for no good reason. I mean, it's kind of harder even now than compared to 20 years ago. But, yeah, it's like, how do you, like, you can do that. Like, if you don't know what the future is and you're willing to just, like, sort of bite the bullet and be like, I don't know. It's not like that. Just because it's not what you were doing doesn't make it inherently bad. So there'd be no connectedness between your previous life, past and future. And so if you really don't know, which is what Calm is sort of pushing, this sort of epistemic humility or sort of like maybe extreme sort of epistemic, like lack of epistemic knowledge, then maybe you are okay with that. I don't know. Okay. Now, one way to be a life holist is to claim that the narrative coherence of one's life overall, or the fact that a person has an upward sloping trajectory rather than downward sloping trajectory, are additional quite weighty objective goods that can outweigh momentary objective goods like pleasure. What the hell is a downward sloping trajectory of your life? Like, Yeah, like I mean, all right. So you're devolving into like drug use and like heroin, and you're just like dying basically. I don't know. Aristotle, what's up? Thanks for stopping by. What if you hate your present life? You only want the moment of the past to carry if it's good. I'm more of a listener. I don't know much in chat, so I'm just saying that's fine, Tinderos. That's fine. I mean, you can hate your present life, and the question here is basically, I don't know if you were here earlier. Question here is, if you have like a future ahead of you that you think is better, like should you not end your life now? And they're trying to argue about reasons here. But what's getting me here is that like when they're talking about life holism, and then it says there's a downward sloping trajectory, on what like on what sort of measure is it downward sloping? I mean, you can hate your present life, sure, and you think you're on your downward sloping and it's terrible. But like if you're not adding stuff up, or if then how do you compare that to like some other life? They're holism. That's the whole point of holism. So, now I think what you're saying is actually you want the moment of the past to carry you if it's good. Like, so you're trying to like get yourself on this upward sloping trajectory, but that gives you a coherence here. So, so this is the question: what is the coherence in a holist? I don't know what a holistic life story is, like a narrative, and I'm actually very skeptical, or you could just say cynical on this case, that people have like coherent life stories that actually make like sense. They might be nice stories. I don't know if this actually has any grand meaning to it other than it's a nice story. And so it's like, I don't know how to connect a nice life story to actual value. Like, that's a nice life story, but then there's the old joke, or whatever it was. A happy story is just one that hasn't ended yet. So it's like the Hollywood ending here, where you're going downward trajectory and you go up, or you're going up and you're going down. I don't know what that means in like a grand sense. I know what it means in terms of a narrative, but I can't connect it to like reality. So Aristotle says, yeah, single path doesn't say too much. Any line will have peaks and valleys, and it's hard to estimate where it's going, especially due to luck. That's right. You haven't. That's exactly right. Even if there is a single path, you could zoom out, and that could just be a little valley or a little peak, and you just don't have the whole picture. And so this is why like scale matters. Like, what is the scale here? And that's why this holism is getting to me. All right, let's continue and see if this author has more to say. If we suppose for the sake of argument that the life of the monk involves only a small amount of pleasure, then Comte's criticism makes sense here. It seems that this kind of life holist cannot say that it makes sense for the aesthete to live on if his only option for doing so is to become a monk, given the fact that he would miss out on the great good of having a narratively coherent life. Like, the great good of having a narratively coherent life. I mean, that how many people have listed having a narratively coherent life as a great good? Like, I've never seen that before, to tell you the truth. But another, and I think preferable way to be a life holist is to claim that there is more value in a person living the lives that she would prefer to live if she were suitably idealized when ranking her possibilities. Oh my lordy lord, what is it to be suitably idealized? This introduces at least some subjective component that ties the normativity of prudential reasons to what one cares about. When suitably idealized, it may be that the aesthete prefers the extended life with the monastic final chapter over the shorter life, or it may be that his preferences are the other way around. The life holist in this way can agree that it is not necessarily senseless to choose the longer life or to choose death in the absence of sufficient connectedness. But in doing so, she need not hold that one and the same individual has sufficient reason to either live on or not to. It may be that, in most cases, the person prudentially ought to continue on as a monk because people would prefer to have a life with the monastic pleasures in it to one with narrative coherence. Or they might even find enough value in the overarching narrative of a person who was once an aesthete but then became a monk to recommend it. The only case in which the person prudentially ought to choose against living on as a monk are cases in which he, when suitably idealized, would find living out one final chapter of life as a monk not worth it, given just how strongly he prefers the coherent life of an aesthete. So in these cases, if the man were to ask why he ought to end his life and not continue on as a monk, the life holist can respond as follows. If you could really appreciate what each of these potential paths would mean for you, you'd see that that is not really worth it to you. It is this that makes choosing to go on not just non-obligatory, but actually an unreasonable choice. It's like, yeah, like, so if you idealize yourself and be like, look, I'm my best self right now, and if I see all these possibilities and my best self is just having a terrible time in there, why would I go do that terrible time? Like, I'm having my best life now. I've had a great life. I'm not even young anymore. I'm just going to say, screw it, I'm out. This reminds me of being like a teenager and like people telling you what you should do with your life, and like they have these ideas about you, and you'd be like, that's nice. Like, you have some weird idea about me, and that's why I should go be a lawyer. I mean, like, I could have been a lawyer. I know how to argue. It's like, but when did I ever actually care about law? I never gave any interest in law, but people were like, oh, you must like this. And so they had some idea of me that I would go be a lawyer because I I like arguments. I do. So it's like, but this is the point. It's like, why would I choose to be a lawyer if, like, under whose conception of the suitable idealization is it? What is suitable? Who cares who gets to decide what a suitable idealization is? Maybe you're an idiot about yourself and you've lived a life as a drug-addled, just like, whoring, whatever. And I'm not even saying it's bad. I'm just saying you might not have any conception of the goods in your life as a monk because you never considered it. And so what would you know of, like, an idealized self? I mean, so it's, like, I could say both lives are great and you wouldn't want to do them. Maybe it's too much work. But who's to say what suitable is? Too many hedge words in this for me. I could use some fun at the moment. Moral and prudential prerogatives. Continuing. Comte's support for the prudential prerogative comes in part from her support for what Scheffler first termed the moral prerogative. The moral prerogative can explain why one is permitted to go on a bicycle ride on a particular morning rather than volunteering to help the homeless. Moral prerogatives, according to Comte, permit an agent to, one, act in ways that do not maximize the impartial good, and two, act for reasons that stem from his personal perspective rather than from the perspective of an impartial judge. So the fundamental features of the prerogative are that it is non-maximizing and perspectival. I think this is what I was kind of saying earlier, so maybe the author is coming around to some of the points I made. Yeah. In the prudential case, though, arguing that we are permitted to be partial non-maximizers won't do much to motivate the prudential prerogative over life holism. Prudential reasons, according to life holism, are already perspectival and in at least some sense non-maximizing. Well, non-maximizing of impartial good. But what is impartial good then? I don't know how to calculate that either. So they are perspectival in that they take into account what makes sense for a person in particular to do given their own values. They are non-maximizing as they allow for holistic values like the value of a particular life narrative to trump lives with higher additive value. While the life holist is committed to thinking that a person ought to pick the potential life with the best score, the score cannot be predicted by summoning amounts of impartial goods contained within the life. It is consistent with life holism, for example, that a life composed entirely of components that have no value on their own may be the best only because of the components hang together just so. So, I'll just be like, add hoc. So this is like, you can just say, you can do an ad hoc, because I don't know, again, how do components hang together just so. Alright. But like, if they have the ad hoc argument available to them, maybe that's cool. One natural way of making sense of the moral prerogative is to hold that prudential reasons can compete with moral reasons. We are justified in engaging our personal projects that fail to maximize impartial good because there is some ratio at which the strength of our prudential reasons competes with the strength of moral reasons, enough that it may take precedence. But when we move from thinking about a moral prerogative to a prudential prerogative, it is unclear what kinds of reasons are meant to play the competing role. Prudential reasons are already perspectival, whereas impartial moral reasons can help perhaps be defeated due to other worthy things you might aspire towards. It is hard to see how there could be self-focused worthy things that you would be justified in doing that are not prudentially good for you. If you want to go on a bicycle ride and you're justified in doing it, what reasons could there be to support it that are neither moral nor prudential reasons? Any plausible candidate, it would seem, would be subsumed under the realm of prudential reasons because anything you are justified in doing for your own benefit would be something that is good for you. This picture of competing kinds of reasons that can make this picture of competing kinds of reasons that can make sense of the moral prerogative, it would seem, does not easily transfer to a way of making sense of the prudential prerogative. Now, I think this is a very good point that the author is making here. This is, I think, their best point in the paper. That this is really where things come apart, the wheels come off over the prudential prerogative. If you're saying that there's some like grand sense of prudentiality, how do you choose against your own grand sense of prudential prerogative? Like if there's some grand thing that you think is good, how do you ever choose against that? You would be doing something inherently irrational by your own lights, by your own reasoning. That's how you should not argue, is to go against what you think is prudential. And this is perspectival. It's in your perspective. So how do you go against what you think is inherently the best thing for you at that time? And that's hard. You can do something non-moral and non-prudential. You could say, well, God wills it. And so then you'd have a metaphysical, like supernatural prerogative that this is just how it is. You could have maybe non-moral virtues. You could have epistemic virtues. So like you could say, hey, look, this is what seems like the best thing to me, but I bet if I were to work at doing this other thing that doesn't seem right, I would be able to gain new habits that would do it. Now, that might compete with, say, look, well, then you have a prudential reason to gain the new habits to be epistemically better, but still, you don't know that at the time. You can't know that. You're just sort of gambling. And so you're saying, well, I'm going to take a gamble at that. So that would mean like, well, there's other things out there. So there might be an epistemic prerogative in that one. So you could have like a metaphysical prerogative, and you could have like an epistemic prerogative to go alongside these moral, and then this would be a rational prerogative is what the prudential one is. So if you could metaphysically break up your universe a little bit, you could do it. But I agree with this author. This is very hard to do. So this is, I think, the strongest part in their paper, and it's I basically think they're right. One suggestion that might seem to help could be the idea that it is not the competing reasons themselves which have value, but rather the value lies in having autonomy to make choices that conflict with what is prudentially best for oneself. In the case of the moral prerogative, common rights, it seems reasonable for the multiplicative factor to depend on the relative importance of the project to the agent, and even to permit the agent to give fundamental projects lexical priority relative to the impartial good. Even this seems an imperfect characterization, since a true prerogative gives the agent the option to care less for himself than for others, and this does not seem to be captured by multiplicative factor greater than 1. This is a reason to think that the prerogative represents a concern for one's autonomy rather than for the importance of one's own project from one's own perspective relative to the interests of others. Yeah, so this is like you'd have some sort of other project going on, which could be the epistemic or metaphysical one. Oh, there's a picture. Nice. Can we give a similar account in the case of prudential prerogative? For the sake of argument, I think we can grant that this kind of autonomy might be important to value when we're setting policy about end-of-life decisions. There's something important, perhaps not being paternalistic and allowing people to have choices even when they make choosing against their own interest. But it does not follow from this that we ought to see these choices as being justified. I doubt that autonomy can undergird a story about how a person can be justified in choosing against what would be for her best possible life. Well, you're reading into what her best possible life is there. I mean, this is very hard to see. And so that's kind of one of these things like, again, this is coming from the view from nowhere, the best possible life, not from their perspective. Now, maybe their brain is addled, maybe they've gotten diseased, and they really can't see what's good for them anymore. But assuming that's not the case, maybe there really is big differences between people. Okay, continuing. The problem is that the autonomy involves the exercise of a certain kind of self-directed freedom from an external perspective. But what is the perspective in this case from which the view of what's best for that person is external? Or to put the point differently, who is exactly claiming freedom from the self? Yeah, so this is why I just brought up mental disease. You might be saying like possession. This is what I was saying about you've got a metaphysical issue that's going on, or you've got a mental disease. So it's basically like you've got your brain is acting against your own best will, like somebody else is in control. So the only candidate it would seem would be a particular person stage. This raises concern. Oh, they're breaking people into different stages, so like the next stage doesn't care about this stage or something. This raises concerns that the freedom sought from the whole self by a person stage is really just a time bias masquerading as a form of intrapersonal rationality. As Comte argues, though, the prudential prerogative does not depend on taking a temporally non-neutral perspective on the future in the sense that it merely allows you to favor avoiding the bads you currently face at the cost of what will be good for you in the future. She has us consider the life represented in the following figure. So, you've got just one of these a graph with not much information on it. You've got a line that curves below this sort of like this like between the good and the bad. That's all we know. I just want to bring up one other thing. Like there was I forget who brought this up, but there were these epistemic breaks. Say you become a vampire, and so from the time before you were a vampire compared to the time you're after a vampire, very different times for you. And so it's like you've got two different stages in your life. And it's hard to say that even... Well, this is the problem, Tenderos. Yes, I think it looks very far away from reality. But in some sense, this is this is for the sake of argument line to think that in some sense, in the past, like before you were a vampire, you thought certain things were bad. Thank you, Avatar. L.A. Paul, Transformative Experiences. Very influential recently. Good book. I read some of it. It was good. So like in the past, you thought like killing people to drink their blood was bad, and then you become a vampire, and you think killing people to drink their blood is good. And so you've got two different stages, and you're biased, of course, depending on where you are in one or the other. Okay. So continuing, we've got this little funky graph here. Suppose the last time you were able to end your life is at Q. And this is Q right here. It says really early in the graph. Comte says that the prudential prerogative could justify the choice to end your life at Q on the basis of not wanting your later self to suffer the bads of the periods between C and D, which is this stuff over here. This is the bads. She concludes, the prudential prerogative is consistent with temporal neutrality towards the future and depends on something, sometimes giving priority to avoiding the worst in the future rather than having the best, and implies that it could be consistent with rationality not to allow one's future life to go below a certain level for the sake of even some greater future goods. Aristotle says, prior to having kids, a congealed crotch goblin seems disgusting and a wreck of your life. After having kids, children are a way of making life meaningful. Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. It's like becoming a parent is some sort of transformative, and you think that like, well, it's going to go all downhill after you have kids, but your decision-making time is over here really early before you have kids. And so how do you make this decision? And so that was sort of one of L.A. Paul's points. But it seems to be relevant right here. Thank you, Aristotle, for bringing that up. Continuing, I agree with Comte that the prudential prerogative doesn't violate temporal neutrality in the sense that it doesn't rely on taking the perspective that you ought to favor your current situation. And that's what the childless adult is sort of doing. They favor their current situation over the situation of having a kid, even though they don't know what it is like to be a parent. However, assuming the entire life represented in the chart is a better life than the one that ends at Q, the view does not seem to hold that it can be intrapersonally rational to favor the good of a certain person's stage, not necessarily the one that you are now, over the good of the person as a whole. You can show favoritism to any of several person stages, even when, from the view of your life overall, doing so doesn't make your life better in any way. This to me seems like at least some form of temporal non-neutrality. While nothing I have said is a knockdown argument against the possibility that our intrapersonal rationality does nevertheless respect the value of this kind of autonomy, justifying our choices made on its basis is certainly not intuitive that we have or would even have reason to want this kind of autonomy. So the author here is just kind of saying, look, would you really want to be that broken apart that you can't really make future decisions on given your current knowledge? And that's a good position, but again, just as Aristotle brought up, you can have kids and you can have wildly different experiences in the future. And if you've had, you've done a lot of work in philosophy, you've had a lot of life experiences, you can start off one way and you can end up someplace else, and it's not what you think was going to happen when you were younger. That's not even a weird thing. That the way your life turns out and the things you think now are not what your past self thought was going to happen. So this is not that crazy that given an immature situation, stage in your life that you can't imagine the future, I mean, it's now from a late life perspective, that's harder to make, but still, it's not as crazy as, I don't even say crazy, it's not as unlikely a situation as this author is making it out to be right here. So, this kind of autonomy, justifying our choices, and that we would have or want this kind of autonomy, that we could be autonomous from our future selves. We might not want it, but we might be stuck with it. Okay, let's finish this up. Kalm says that the moral prerogative can be seen as a byproduct of the fact that moral obligation is not about producing as much good as possible. It is about respect for persons and doing as much good as that requires. This line of thought is appealing. I would argue that prudential rationality likewise is not about producing the greatest sum of momentary prudential goods as possible, but is rather about respect for oneself as a person. Respect for yourself as a person, though, just is aspiring to live your best life. This is reason to favor life holism and not the prudential prerogative. Okay, this is a nice paper. I thought it was actually reasonably well argued. I have problems with the general structure of many of these arguments, but again, as I said earlier, and I want to stress, this is not this author's fault. It's not they screwed up the argumentation here. They did not. There was a few things I sort of hammered them on when these sort of, oh, hey, Tinderos, I'll get to that in a sec. I just want to say I hammered them a few times when I thought they were kind of begging the question, as they were treating the holism as a kind of compositional holism. And once you do compositionality, you're getting a kind of additive. A lot of times you're sneaking in additivity. Okay, Tinderos says, got a different example. I didn't have a depression. I haven't met somebody with a real diagnosed depression, and thought it's something you can change by yourself more easily in a couple of weeks. Got depression and first realized afterwards that you don't directly know what you got. What you know is it gets a bit worse, and when you want to do something against it by your own it takes months later until it gets better. That's exactly right. Things happen, and it's not that unusual for us to get into a state where you don't think certain things are coming, certain outcomes are possible, and you don't realize the differences in the ways you could be or the way life could be. And so this is not an unusual thing that happens. And so maybe it's been stigmatized in the past, and maybe that's why philosophy has not come to grips with this sort of thing yet. And that's one of the benefits of L.A. Paul's writing, is that there are these sort of changes, and they need further study. They may not need to be as big as turning into a vampire, but or just becoming a parent. And of course, some people are not affected by being a parent. Granted, you need a lot of money to just keep living your life that way. But even little things like sicknesses, depressions, things like that, people who have not been injured before, who have had health, or blessed with good health, they get hurt and their world all of a sudden changes for them. All of a sudden they're angry at doctors. They don't think doctors are the same anymore. They don't think a whole lot of things are very different for them. I've seen this happen. So it's these sorts of, that we have a lot of faith in this, that the author put a lot of faith in sort of our idealized selves projecting the future. I just don't hold the same sort of assumption about how we can make prudential decisions. So that's sort of just a big disagreement between myself and the author here. So let's see, is there anything else to say? If you guys have questions, you folks out there in Twitch land, please let me know. Yeah, let's see, anything else to say? Yeah, I agree with the author. What was that one spot? Yeah, so here's the thing. Again, then the question is, but what sort of decision can you make? And this is, I think, the author's best point. I just want to reiterate this. What are you supposed to do in this case? I mean, you need a little bit of epistemic humility. You can go learn stuff, but you still have to. You might have to read this paper more closely. Well, it's in analysis, so it's short, which is one of my favorite parts about analysis. Everything's short. But yeah, and so the question, this is I think their best argument is that if you are going to hang your hat on some sort of rational decision making, then how do you ever actually argue against your rational decision making? You can't. You are, in some sense, dependent and completely locked in to always following this argument. And so the basis of modeling this sort of like, well, you don't quite know what's going to happen, you can't make that argument at that point. And I think that this author that's a good point that the author makes here against the prudential prerogative. Yeah. So, do I know what the answer is here? Additivism, I just, if you want to be a consequentialist, go for it. Life holism, if you want to be a secret consequentialist, you can. It's consequentialism with more steps, in my opinion. Go for that. You just feel better about yourself sometimes. It's not usually getting you anywhere. And then this other thing is like, well, you're arguing against your own rationality. I don't know if any of these things are great. But to be fair, Aristotle, I could say consequentialism is just deontology with more steps too. Like, I don't even I have trouble making strong distinctions. So it's just consequentialism, and because one of them you're adding up values and the other one you're adding up rules that you're following. I don't know how to figure out either of those. My problems though. Alright, but that's about it. I've been streaming for an hour and I have not streamed in forever, so I just wanted to get one in. Aristotle says, what about gut feelings and damage mitigation? I don't mean to be glib. I think that's how most people live. Yes. Okay. So how do you most people are deciding by the seat of their pants most of the time, and that is life. That is not a bad question at all. It's like, if you don't have time to reason everything out, which is most of the time, what are you doing? So let's see. Well, I think what these people would say, Aristotle, I'll get to you in a moment, Tinderos. You're using heuristics, probably. You're probably doing the best you can, and that's how could you decide to do any differently? You're doing the best you can at the time, and that means the best addition you can, your best view of your life that you have, or the best view of rationality that you have. And so what you're doing is you're doing the best at the time. I think that's just sort of the reasonable answer. Like no one has a good answer about that. I guess you could, as a virtue theorist, you could say, look, well, I've trained myself to have certain sort of reactions, to have habits, to do stuff like that, and then I follow those. And that would be a slight, I think, twist on life holism. That would say, well, I've got virtue holism and I do what my virtues say. That's what I do. It's like, well, if my virtues say now's the time to die, now's the time to die. My virtues say soldier on, then I soldier on. And so that would be the coherent story that your life is. It's that you've got a coherent story of virtues. So that would at least give you another step in the holism view here. And you can also, as I mentioned earlier, I don't know if you were here, if you have epistemic virtues, or rational virtues, then you could throw those in the mix. And that would also be what you could say, hey, look, I rationally decide according to these rational virtues, and that's how I make it. And it's not that I'm looking at my narrative, I'm looking at my best reasoning abilities and that sort of thing. So that would give you a different kind of holism. I don't know how, you could take it a lot farther than me, more way more about this stuff. But, you know, that people go by what they feel and fly by the seat of their pants. That's how far we've gotten up until now. So who am I to complain about that? Like, maybe we're heading off a cliff, but they've got us this far. So it's the old pragmatist line. We can't always be wrong. Aristotle says, it's interesting, but I think I should hold a view like holism, but this paper is actually making me see that holism might not be a good position. I don't think it's the paper. I'm thinking it's me. Because the paper actually didn't say a whole lot against holism. They were arguing against this prudential prerogative. I apologize to you and the author here for like stomping on, like to just forcing my views on folks. But yeah, let me get to Tindarios. I'll come back to you in a sec. Tindarios says, when I was like under 20, I thought philosophy is boring as hell, and most people I met just wanted to distinguish oneself. Now I'm reading one book after another, and always on the lookout for different thoughts. Yeah, and that's the thing. You change significantly over time. This is not unusual. This is the norm. This is the common thing for us to change. And so it's like the idea that we can see ideal selves when we're younger, I mean, maybe it gets a little less likely when we're older that we're going to change how we see ourselves, but that the idea that we're not going to seems a little short-sighted. So, very interesting questions about identity here and like self-knowledge. So, I mean, how are you supposed to that's the question. Why do we make kids choose what they're going to be when they grow up? It is terrible. Aristotle says, I think I'm just deeply skeptical about making a sense of things and projecting into the future. We work with probabilities and foreseeable contingencies, and that can work most of the time. Maybe. What about those other cases? No, it's the author's fault. It's a consequence of the pragmatist skepticism I have. Okay, fine. You can have. It's not my fault. Happy to pass it off. Yeah, this is the problem. This person, the author, clearly thinks that you can form a narrative, and if you don't hold that assumption, you're just not going to agree with them. And I don't agree with them. I find you can hold a narrative. Actually, that's one of the easiest things to do nowadays. That's the word gets thrown around all the time, and so it's like, but what does it amount to in the end? I don't actually have a good answer to what narratives amount to in the end. If it's how you make your decisions, as this author believes, that you have a narrative and this is how we do stuff, or is it really more of what Aristotle just said above, like right over? I don't know if you can see. You can't see. Is it seat of the pants stuff? I think most of the time it's seat of the pants stuff, but again, the author might disagree. Yeah, and that's right. It depends on what you mean by narrative. It means how you fit something into a narrative. And my grandma, she had plenty of narratives, but she also knew she was irrational. Like, she couldn't explain everything in her narrative. And so she would say, look, you don't have to, I'm not going to explain this. I'm just going to do it. And she would say everyone's irrational about how they use their money. She was not irrational. She was very consistent about how she was going to use her money, but she wouldn't explain it. And I think she thought it would be too hard to like get everything like explainable. And I think she was right. So Aristotle says idealized selves are way different than, say, Nietzsche's recommendation to make the ugly and the beautiful make a good story. Yeah. Completely agree. That's not what's going on in this. Like, Nietzsche was about some grand thing, and this is looking at worldly possibilities here. So again, this is a fittingness, like fitting yourself into the world, fitting your life into like some conception you have of yourself. And so the idea that you're making a good story is like Nietzsche is up to like something else. He's got some other concepts of like life narratives. These people have like the ones that were exampled. They had like long lives behind them, and they were basically trying to fit their future decisions into that. And that's not a good story in the sense that, well, it'd be like a rounding out of the story. But like, again, how much weight do you really put into rounding out the end of a story? Some people might put a lot. I don't know how you make that, how much weight that actually has, how many people actually would want to make a good story and their death be a good story. Maybe they do. Maybe they want to go on. Maybe they don't. But like, even in any case, you'd have to have it's a very strong position. That's all I want to say. So living your best life. If anyone ever knows what best is, please tell me. It's fun. We were in the Walterverse's stream yesterday, and he's, he likes his little existential crisis as a chatting topic. And he was looking for meaning in life, and I got timed out trying to say stuff because I was trolling, and but this is the problem. It's too easy. It is too easy to give an account of narrative of your life. That's the problem. Not that there's no not that we can't find meaning in life. It's that it's too easy to find meaning in life. It's too easy to give narrative. It's too easy to add things up. It's too easy to be like, well, this sounds like a cool life. Like, where's the value, though? And that's the problem. It's not that there is no meaning in life. It's that there's no firm meaning. There's too much meaning. It's too easy to get. It's all cheap. And I think that's behind a lot of these existential questions people have. They're like, well, I love my wife, I love my kid, I work my ass off to provide for them and myself and have a good time. And yeah, objective list first. Yeah, sure. Food, house, all that stuff. But then once you get past that stuff, it's like, well, sure, we've got a good, nice society now. At least some of the world has a nice society now. A lot of problems, of course, but where's the meaning then if you've got past the basic stuff? And that's a very, very, very different question. How do you, and the question was how do you make more meaning after that? Just reading an article about holism is used in psychology. A lot of good psych on holism too. A lot of it. Focus, holism, all sorts of things in psychology about this. Good work over there being done. So people want a simple answer, for the, as you said, the objective stuff. Do you have food to eat? Do you have a roof over your head? People want simple answers like that. But once you get past that, question. Oh, we got a link here. What is holism? Let's see. Copy link. Okay, so what is this? Verywellmind.com. So yeah, all right. I'm not going to read this now, but this is so we've got a section on holism and psychology, how it's used. Yeah, so the goal of this level of analysis is to be able to not only consider how each of these variables might impact overall well-being, but to also see how these factors interact and influence one another. See, that's the thing. It's how do you put this into a narrative? How does it interact and influence everything else? And so, yeah, people are working on this. This is active research. So that's a good link. So things to worry about. Of course, yeah, so what is the best life? I mean, I would actually go at least Nietzsche knew better than to do what this author, these authors, not just this author, this sort of story that these authors are sort of all arguing about. Nietzsche, I think, knew better that you have to go farther than this. And so that's part of it. I think Nietzsche said, look, you're creating a narrative, but it's not just you're not fitting yourself into a narrative and making a nice story. You have to, in some sense, do something different. You're making a new narrative. You have to go beyond. And at least, so I think Nietzsche had some sense that in the modern times, when you have all this technology and things like that, you have to go beyond the current understanding of what counts as a good life, because that does seem a little regressive. And I think that's maybe that's my biggest gripe with this paper, is that this seems like it's sitting in the 1800s of heyday of Kant and John, well, not even John Stuart, Hume, just the heyday of utilitarianism and deontology, and it's sort of arguing about that stuff. And that stuff is great, but it seems we've Nietzsche hashed this out a little. And so I think maybe that's my biggest gripe, is that it just seems backwards facing. Okay, so calm as a Kantian. Unsurprising. Interesting, but unsurprising. I mean, that's who's dominating the discussion, though. It's mostly the same folks. And for good reason. I mean, they have a ton to say, but sometimes for not so good reasons also, because, academia. But yeah, just to wrap up, not actually a bad paper. It's just in the tradition at the moment. So it's like in tradition, and my gripe is, well, yeah, I don't agree with the tradition, but we're in tradition. But it's a good paper in that sense, and like, it's an analysis because it is a good paper in this tradition that says something, on contemporary topics. So, okie dokie. If that is all, I wish you all a good night. Happy I'm streaming a little bit again. I will try to stream more. Go live your best life. If whatever your best life is, go do it. I would suggest avoiding the things this author has tried to tell you to do. Go idealize yourself and go like be your skewed version of like the person you want to be. Although I think a lot of people say that, yeah. There's a lot of things to work on. I just say pick a project and get off your butt. So, please stream more. Oh, thank you for the bits, Tindarios. I will try to stream more. Thank you very, very much. I don't have any alerts. I have no graphics, but I thank you. I should do stuff like that. Yeah. But too busy with too many things all of a sudden. And it's, I'm tired and grumpy. So have a good night, folks.